Elliot Haines didn't look like the type of man the world would one day call a god. He was, in fact, the last person anyone would have expected to hold such a title. He wasn't tall or imposing, nor did he have the charisma that seemed to come with the weight of divinity. He was just a 33-year-old physicist at the Institute of Advanced Gravitational Studies in San Francisco, and most of his coworkers knew him for two things: his wildly disorganized desk and his ability to make even the most boring topics, like subatomic particle theory or quantum entanglement, seem as thrilling as watching paint dry. But that was before the experiment that IT wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary. Elliot had been tasked with running a relatively simple test on gravitational waves, basically measuring tiny fluctuations in the fabric of space-time itself. The experiment was supposed to help confirm an obscure theory from the early 21st century, a theory that no one really cared about anymore because, frankly, it sounded ridiculous. "You know, Elliot," his colleague Margaret said, tapping her pen against her coffee cup, "if you actually followed the protocol for once, you might avoid blowing up the lab." "Again." "I'm telling you," Elliot replied, half smiling, "this is going to be different. Nothing's going to explode this time." He grinned as he flipped the switch that would begin the test that it wasn't long before things went, well, differently. The equipment in the lab hummed in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. The air seemed to grow denser, like it was vibrating with some unseen energy. Elliot glanced up at the monitors, eyes widening. "Margaret. I think we've got a problem." "That's an understatement," she muttered, standing and moving toward the console, but before they could make sense of the readings, the gravitational anomaly began to escalate at a rate neither of them had anticipated. A ripple of energy surged through the lab, too quickly for anyone to react. The world around them began to warp. First, the papers on Elliot's desk began to levitate. It was subtle at first, as if the air had grown thicker. Then, the walls of the building started to stretch out, the steel beams groaning as they bent and twisted in impossible directions. The light fixtures above flickered, and suddenly, the entire lab plunged into a chaotic zero-gravity state. Margaret screamed, grabbing onto a nearby countertop, but Elliot didn't feel the panic. Instead, something strange washed over him. It was like a surge of power that wasn't his, yet it coursed through him, bending reality itself. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and when he opened them again, he saw the impossible. The entire building was floating, weightless, suspended in the air like a marble in space. Papers, furniture, even the coffee cup Margaret had just been sipping from, hovered in midair. Elliot didn't know what was happening, but he didn't question it either. This was something else entirely. He wasn't afraid. He was exhilarated. Then, as quickly as it started, the anomaly ceased. The building snapped back to its original position, and everything fell with a thunderous crash, including Elliot, who landed squarely on his backside. But as he sat up, he realized he wasn't just hearing the sound of objects falling. The world outside was completely silent. The building was still standing, but the effects had extended far beyond the lab. The entire skyline of San Francisco seemed to shimmer as if reality itself had been briefly altered. It was as though some invisible force had just brushed the city and reshaped it in its image. Margaret, who had landed on the floor beside him, was wide-eyed and breathing heavily. "What the hell did you just do, Elliot?" Before he could answer, the door to the lab burst open, and a swarm of security personnel, led by a very frazzled Dr. Jenkins, the director of the institute, rushed in. They stopped dead in their tracks, all eyes on the floating equipment and the completely untouched building. "What in the world?" Jenkins gasped. Elliot blinked, finally processing the situation. "I didn't do that. Not on purpose, anyway." Dr. Jenkins, still dumbfounded, gave a half-hearted chuckle. "You didn't do that, and yet you're the only one here who isn't floating away with the debris. What kind of experiment did you run this time, Haines?" "I swear, it was supposed to be just a simple test," Elliot muttered, still sitting on the floor. Jenkins took a few steps forward, his expression shifting from bewilderment to something else. "We're going to need to report this," he said, pulling out his phone. "This is bigger than anything we could have anticipated. Someone needs to know about this." The next few hours were a blur. Elliot was kept in a small room and questioned repeatedly by government agents, physicists, and the occasional conspiracy theorist who seemed to think he was secretly an alien or a time traveler. No one really knew what had happened, and as the reports came in, they only confirmed that something extraordinary had occurred in the city. By the end of the day, the headlines began to emerge: "Mysterious gravitational anomaly strikes San Francisco. Scientist Elliot Haines at the center of it all." At first, it seemed like a localized event. But as the hours wore on, the news spread like wildfire. People around the world started to ask the same question: who was Elliot Haines, and what exactly had he done to cause this shift in gravity? The media didn't take long to come up with a name. The Gravity God, they called him. Elliot didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the span of a single day, his life had gone from being a mild-mannered, underappreciated physicist to an international phenomenon. In a strange twist of fate, he had somehow become the one thing he never wanted to be, the center of the world's attention. That night, as Elliot lay awake in his sterile, government-assigned hotel room, trying to process the surreal events of the day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than him was at play. His powers, if that's what they were, felt beyond his control, and he had no idea how to fix the damage he'd caused. And it wasn't just the chaos in San Francisco that worried him. He felt an unsettling sensation, like he was being watched by something, or someone. He turned over in bed, his thoughts racing, when suddenly, a soft vibration began to hum through the room. Elliot froze. Was it just his nerves, or was the room shifting again? He could feel it, the weight of the air pressing down on him. The walls seemed to bend in and out, as though space itself was warping around him. He gripped the edge of the bed, his breath quickening. And then, through the veil of reality, a voice boomed in his mind. "You have attracted our attention, human." Elliot's breath caught in his chest as the voice reverberated through his mind. It wasn't like hearing someone speak. No, it was deeper, resonating in the very bones of his body, as though the words themselves were part of the fabric of existence. "You have attracted our attention, human." Elliot bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding in his ears. His pulse thudded, and for a second, he wondered if he was dreaming, or perhaps still trapped in the aftermath of the lab disaster. He glanced around the hotel room, ordinary. Nothing out of place. But he could still feel it, that shifting pressure in the air. "Who's there?" His voice trembled, and though the words left his lips, he wasn't sure they'd even reached whoever was listening. "We are the gods of the cosmos," the voice continued, this time with a subtle, omnipotent echo. "Your presence has disturbed the natural balance of the universe. You will be tested, for your power is both dangerous and fascinating." Elliot swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the bed frame. His mind raced. Gods? Of course, the media had dubbed him the Gravity God, but that was just a name. A joke. A sensationalized headline. The last thing he expected was for it to be real. Was he hallucinating? Maybe the stress was finally getting to him. Maybe the accident in the lab had triggered something in his brain, but then the air shifted again. This time, it wasn't just a subtle hum, it was more like the deep rumble of a distant storm, shaking the room ever so slightly. Elliot could feel the force before he even saw it. From the corner of the room, a crack in the very fabric of space appeared. At first, it was no larger than a pinprick, but then it expanded, widening into a circular tear in the air itself. Through it, a deep, starry void stretched endlessly, like a portal opening into the vastness of space. Elliot's stomach lurched. He stood up too quickly, his vision swimming as he backed away from the portal. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The voice returned, not in his mind, but now resonating from the portal itself. "Do not be afraid, Gravity God. You are not the first to possess such powers, and you will not be the last. But the universe has its own order. And we, its keepers, will decide your place in it. The portal rippled, and a figure stepped through. It was a being of impossible dimensions, taller than any human and covered in swirling, shifting shadows. Its face was not visible, but instead, an endless pattern of lights danced across where eyes should be, as if the very fabric of its being was made of stars and darkness intertwined. Elliot took an instinctive step back, his heart racing. What are you?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. The figure's form seemed to pulse, like the tides of an unseen ocean. "I am Zarkin, the god of chaos. I am the embodiment of imbalance, the force that tears apart what you so desperately cling to. And you, gravity god, have awakened me." Zarkin's voice, though immense and booming, carried an undercurrent of amusement. "Your little experiment, however misguided, has pulled the threads of the universe out of alignment. Your power, your ability to bend the very laws of physics." It paused, as though savoring the words. "It is both fascinating and dangerous." Elliot stumbled backward, his mind whirling. This couldn't be real. Could it? You're a god?" He barely managed to whisper the words. Zarkin tilted its head in what seemed like amusement. "Do not be so hasty in your assumptions, human. I am not a god in the way you understand. I am a force, a principle of the cosmos. A god in the same sense that gravity is a god." It chuckled, a low, guttural sound that rattled the walls. "But yes, I suppose, if you must, you may call me that." The room began to shift once again, gravity warping in strange, unpredictable ways. The bed rose from the floor, rotating slowly in midair. Elliot reached out instinctively, trying to steady himself as the very air around him seemed to distort. "I didn't mean to," he began, but Zarkin waved a dismissive hand, cutting him off. "It does not matter what you meant, human," the voice rumbled. "What matters is what you have done. What you have become." Okay, Elliot muttered, trying to grasp at his sanity in the face of this incomprehensible situation. "What do you want from me? What am I supposed to do now?" Zarkin's form rippled, its lights flashing in a complex, shifting pattern. "You are but a toy caught in the web of fate, gravity god. You think you control the forces of nature, but those forces, we, control you. You may shape gravity, but it is not your domain. It is ours. And now, you must prove your worth." A shiver ran down Elliot's spine. "What do you mean? How can I prove anything to you? I don't even understand what's going on." "You will understand soon enough," Zarkin replied, its form beginning to dissolve into the shifting stars. "But be warned, gravity god, the tests will come. The others will be here soon, and they will judge you as I have judged you. You will either rise to your power, or you will fall, like the countless others before you." With that, the figure vanished, the portal collapsing in on itself until there was nothing left but the faint hum of gravity returning to normal. But Elliot wasn't left alone for long. Barely a moment passed before the walls of his hotel room rippled again. This time, instead of a black void, the air shimmered with bright, almost blinding light. Another figure emerged, this one not made of shadows but of glowing, radiant threads, woven together in a shimmering pattern of time itself. It was a woman, or at least, it appeared to be. She was tall, but graceful, her presence commanding without being aggressive. She looked at him with eyes that were both ancient and knowing, as if she had seen everything that had ever happened, would ever happen, and perhaps even everything that might never come to pass. "I am Kalia, the Time Weaver," she spoke, her voice soft but weighted with centuries of wisdom. "And you, gravity god, have meddled with the delicate balance of time. I am here to guide you, to show you the path you must take, or to warn you of the consequences." Elliot's head spun. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, right? He looked around, hoping to spot a hidden camera, but saw nothing unusual. You're another god?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Not a god in the way you would understand," Kalia replied, smiling slightly, as though humoring a child. I am the weaver of time, the keeper of moments. And now, because of your actions, time itself begins to unravel. Your experiment has created fractures in the timeline, ripples that will not go unnoticed. Elliot tried to make sense of her words. I didn't mean to, of course, you didn't mean to, Kalia interjected, almost amused. No one ever means to. But your intentions are irrelevant now. What matters is the future. The present. The now. And the consequences of your actions will ripple across all of it. She raised a hand, and suddenly, the room was no longer a hotel. Instead, Elliot stood in the middle of an endless field of stars, as though the very fabric of the universe itself had opened up to reveal its core. The cosmos stretched out before him, limitless, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. This is what you have set in motion, she continued, her voice reverberating around him like a whisper of wind through the stars. Do you see it? The threads of reality are fraying. And you, gravity god, are the one who will either mend them, or let them unravel completely. Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was reeling. All he wanted was to go back to his ordinary life, to his predictable world. But the universe had other plans for him, and just as he thought he might lose himself in the vastness of space and time, Kalia snapped her fingers, and the world around him collapsed back into the hotel room. Think carefully, she warned, her voice a final, lingering echo. You are at the center of something much larger than yourself. And the others are already on their way. Before Elliot could respond, she vanished, leaving him alone once more in the silence of his mind. Elliot stood there in the silent hotel room, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to wrap his mind around everything that had just happened. The air still felt thick, charged with the energy of the two gods, or beings, or whatever they were, that had just spoken to him. The weight of their words hung in the space like an oppressive fog, suffocating and inescapable. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into the abyss, and he had no idea how far it went, or whether he could survive the fall. The feeling was almost unbearable. His heart pounded in his chest, and the room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him like a vice. He was the gravity god, but what did that even mean? Zarkin, the god of chaos, had made it clear that his powers were an anomaly in the cosmic order, something that had disturbed the natural flow of the universe. Kalia, the time weaver, had shown him glimpses of a timeline unraveling, a universe on the brink of collapse. And he was the one at the center of it all. He was the one responsible. Elliot sank down onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. This was too much. Too much to comprehend. He had never asked for this power, never wanted it. All he had wanted was to do his job, to be left alone to study physics and unravel the mysteries of the universe in a controlled, predictable environment. But instead, he had become the very thing he had always studied, a force of nature. A living paradox, and now, the gods, the keepers of the cosmic order, were coming for him. He didn't know what their tests would involve, but the way they had spoken, the way they had dismissed him, made it clear that there was no escaping them. No bargaining with them. The door to the room creaked open, and Elliot jumped, his pulse spiking. He hadn't heard anyone approaching, and for a moment, panic seized him. He half expected another god to materialize, or some cosmic catastrophe to unfold right in front of him, but it wasn't a god that walked through the door. It was Margaret. She looked startled when she saw him sitting on the bed, his face pale, his eyes wild. Elliot? Are you okay? She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I saw the news. People are freaking out about what happened earlier today. They're calling you a god, and, she paused when she saw his expression. Elliot, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain everything, how he was no longer just a scientist, how the universe had decided that he was the fulcrum on which everything balanced. But he couldn't. Not yet. How could he explain this? How could he make her understand? "I don't know, Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't understand any of this. These beings, they've come to me. They say I've upset the balance of the universe. That I'm somehow the center of it all." Margaret took a few tentative steps toward him, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Wait, you're saying this whole thing, the gravity anomaly, the buildings floating, everything, isn't just some freak accident?" He shook his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "No. It's real. And it's bigger than I ever imagined. I've done something. Something that's changed everything." She knelt in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Elliot, listen to me. You don't have to do this alone. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. I don't know what's going on, but I trust you." For a moment, Elliot considered what she was offering. But he knew he couldn't drag her into this. This wasn't her fight. She didn't deserve to be caught in the gravitational pull of this cosmic mess. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, "but I don't think there's anything anyone can do now. I've opened a door that shouldn't have been opened, and now it's only a matter of time before—" He cut himself off, the words choking in his throat. A sudden, sharp pressure built in the air. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the atmosphere, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then, just as quickly, it intensified, and Elliot's body tensed instinctively, every nerve screaming at him to do something, to fight back. He could feel the gravitational forces at play, the weight of the universe pushing in on him. The door slammed open, and this time, it wasn't Margaret who stepped in. It was something else entirely. A figure cloaked in shifting, translucent light stepped into the room, radiating an energy so potent that it seemed to warp the very air around it. The figure was humanoid in shape, but its features were obscured by a veil of light that pulsed with energy. It was as if the being was made of the same raw energy that had birthed the universe itself. "Elliot Haynes," it spoke, its voice the sound of countless echoes reverberating through time and space. "You have been found wanting." Elliot froze, his body locked in place by the sheer weight of the presence in front of him. He could feel the gravitational pressure mounting, pressing down on him with the force of 1,000 suns. It was as if the very air itself had become dense, like he was standing in the core of a collapsing star. "You," he gasped, trying to find his voice. "You're one of them, aren't you?" The being tilted its head, the lights that made up its face shifting in a slow, deliberate motion. "I am Zalin, the cosmic observer. I have watched the unfolding of your reality since its inception. And I have come to pass judgment on your actions." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "Judgment? What do you want from me? What do you want to do to me?" Zalin's form shimmered, and Elliot could feel the energy of the universe itself gathering around the being. "Your power is unnatural. It was not meant for you, nor is it meant for any being to possess. You have violated the balance of existence. You have caused ripples in the fabric of time, altered the course of events that were never meant to be disturbed." Elliot's mind raced. "I didn't mean to," Zalin cut him off with a wave of its hand. "Your intentions are irrelevant. You are a catalyst for chaos, an anomaly in the system. And now, you will face the consequences of your actions." With a flick of its wrist, Zalin caused the room to shift once again. This time, the walls themselves seemed to dissolve, replaced by an endless void of stars. The ground beneath Elliot's feet vanished, and he found himself floating in the darkness, weightless and adrift in the infinite expanse of space. "You will face the gods of the cosmos," Zalin continued, its voice like thunder in the void. "And you will prove yourself worthy, or you will cease to exist. The choice is yours." Elliot's mind screamed. How could he possibly fight back against something so powerful? How could he win against an entity that existed outside of time itself, whose very presence bent the universe to its will? But then, something inside him shifted. He felt it deep within his core, the pull of his own power. The force that had been unleashed when he first tapped into the anomaly in the lab. It was raw, untamed, and now, it was his only hope. "I'm not going down without a fight," Elliot muttered to himself, his hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the gravity of the situation, quite literally, pressing in on him. He had no idea how he was going to do this, but he couldn't just let himself be swept away by fate. Zolan's eyes, if they could be called eyes, seemed to narrow. "You are a fool to resist, gravity god. You cannot comprehend the forces at play here. You are insignificant in the grand scheme of things." But Elliot didn't listen. He reached out, his mind focusing on the one thing he could control, the gravity. He could feel the force of the universe shifting under his fingertips, bending to his will, and then, in an instant, everything changed. The universe twisted. Time bent. Gravity surged. For the first time in his life, Elliot Haines wasn't afraid of his power. He embraced it, and the cosmos responded.